Clara sat at the edge of her wooden chair, her fingers brushing against the cool, smooth surface of an unmarked envelope. The soft glow of the evening sun filtered through the curtains, but her attention was fixed solely on the letter. She opened it cautiously, her pulse quickening with every second. The words on the page blurred for a moment before coming into sharp focus. Someone new, her past, which she had buried so carefully, was suddenly clawing its way back to the surface. Clara felt her chest tighten as if the air around her had thinned. This was no ordinary message. It was a threat wrapped in silence. Her mind raced as she reread the cryptic lines, trying to piece together the identity of the sender. Could it be someone from the school? A former student? Or worse, someone from her past in Bella Vista? She shook her head, dismissing the thought as quickly as it appeared. She couldn't let this consume her, not now. But her body betrayed her resolve. Her hands trembled and her heart thudded in a panicked rhythm. Clara knew one thing for certain. This letter was only the beginning. The familiar creak of the front door brought her out of her frantic thoughts. Daniel was home. Clara's heart skipped a beat as she hastily folded the letter and shoved it under a stack of unopened bills. Her fiancé's cheerful voice echoed through the hall, his footsteps approaching quickly. She forced herself to breathe, plastering a smile onto her face. As Daniel entered, he noticed nothing amiss, greeting her with his usual warmth. Clara, however, felt as though she was walking on thin ice. Later that night, while Daniel dozed on the couch, Clara sat in silence at the dining table. The letter, now crumpled and slightly torn, was back in her hands. Her best friend Julia's words echoed in her mind. "You've always been too good at hiding things, Clara." Could Julia sense something already? Clara felt a shiver run down her spine. She needed to act quickly, but every choice seemed to lead her closer to the edge of a dangerous precipice. The next morning, Clara couldn't shake the weight of the letter as she walked to her classroom. The air in Bella Vista was crisp, carrying the faint scent of wet earth from the previous night's rain, but it did little to calm her nerves. Every familiar face she passed on the way felt like a potential enemy. She plastered on a polite smile as neighbors greeted her, but the fear lingered just beneath the surface. Inside her mind, questions swirled relentlessly. Who knows? What do they want? How far will they go? These thoughts made her steps feel heavier, her once confident stride now uncertain and faltering. Inside the classroom, Clara tried to immerse herself in her work. The chatter of her students and the rhythm of their routine had always been her escape, but today it felt distant, like a melody she could no longer follow. Julia, her closest friend and colleague, caught Clara's distracted gaze several times. "You look like you haven't slept," Julia commented during the break, her voice laced with concern. Clara forced a laugh and brushed it off with a flimsy excuse about lesson planning, but Julia wasn't convinced. Her eyes narrowed slightly, her expression silently demanding an explanation. By lunchtime, Clara's resolve was crumbling. She found herself clutching her coffee cup with trembling hands, her mind replaying the moment she read the letter. Julia's presence across the table felt both comforting and intrusive. "Clara, talk to me," Julia urged, leaning closer. "I know something's wrong." Clara hesitated, staring into the dark liquid in her cup as though it held the answers. Telling Julia the truth was out of the question. She couldn't risk dragging her friend into this. "I'm fine," Clara said finally, her voice quieter than she intended. The lie hung in the air like a shadow between them. As the day wore on, Clara's unease only grew. Back at home, she found herself pacing the living room, the crumpled letter now hidden deep in her bag. Daniel noticed her agitation but said nothing, perhaps hoping she would open up on her own. Clara couldn't bring herself to face him with the truth. Instead, she avoided his gaze, retreating to the solitude of their bedroom. As she sat on the edge of the bed, the faint hum of voices outside the window reminded her of how exposed she truly was. The letter was a ticking time bomb, and Clara had no idea how long she had before it detonated. As the night deepened, silence filled the house, broken only by the soft ticking of the clock. Clara sat in the dimly lit kitchen, her thoughts a tangled mess of fear and desperation. She pulled the letter from her bag once more, her eyes scanning the menacing words as though they might change if she stared long enough. The anonymity of it was the worst part. No clues, no handwriting she recognized, just an unrelenting reminder that someone out there knew her secret. Her fingers traced the edges of the paper, her mind replaying fragments of her past she had tried so hard to bury. Memories of her life in Bella Vista resurfaced, vivid and uninvited. She had built her reputation as a dedicated teacher, a kind neighbor, and a loyal fiancé. To most, Clara was an image of perfection, someone who had her life together. But now, that image was cracking. She felt like a performer on stage, her every move scrutinized, waiting for the moment when the curtain would drop and her truth would be exposed. The thought of Daniel finding out twisted her stomach in knots. He deserved the truth, but how could she risk losing him? A sudden knock at the door startled Clara, sending the letter tumbling to the floor. She froze, her heartbeat racing as her mind leapt to the worst conclusions. Gathering her courage, she approached the door slowly, only to find Julia standing there, her face etched with concern. "Clara, I couldn't leave things like this," she said softly. "You've been acting strange all day. Please, tell me what's going on." Clara hesitated, her instinct to confide battling with the need to protect her secret. She opened her mouth, but no words came. Julia's gaze searched hers, filled with worry and patience. Before Clara could respond, Daniel appeared at the top of the stairs, his voice breaking the tension. "Is everything all right down there?" he called, his silhouette illuminated by the hallway light. Clara quickly picked up the letter and slipped it into her pocket, her hands trembling. "Everything's fine," she replied, her voice unsteady. Julia looked between them, sensing the growing strain. Clara knew she couldn't keep this act up for long. The walls were closing in, and she was running out of places to hide. Clara sat alone on the edge of her bed, staring out at the quiet streets of Bella Vista. The early morning mist clung to the windows, blurring the outlines of the world outside. But the fog in her mind was even thicker. The letter had awakened memories she had long tried to forget, fragments of a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. Images of Lucas flashed in her mind. His laughter, his carefree energy, and that fateful day when everything changed. Clara closed her eyes, but the memories were relentless, pulling her back into the depths of a past she thought she had buried. Lucas had been more than just a friend. He was her confidant, her anchor during the stormy years of adolescence. The two of them, along with Andre, had been inseparable. They spent long summer days exploring the fields outside the town, their laughter echoing through the open skies. But those moments of innocence had been shattered by a single night, a night Clara could never erase from her mind. She remembered the cold, the dark, and the overwhelming weight of guilt that had followed her ever since. It was that guilt that had shaped her, driving her to create the controlled, composed life she now clung to. As she drifted deeper into the past, Clara recalled the small, abandoned bridge where they had last seen Lucas. The bridge had been their secret spot, a place where they shared their dreams and fears, far from the prying eyes of the world. But on that fateful evening, the laughter had turned to silence. Clara remembered the tension in the air, the arguments, and then Lucas was gone. She had replayed that moment countless times, searching for answers that never came. Each memory felt like a jagged piece of glass, cutting deeper into her as she tried to piece them together. The guilt wasn't hers alone. Andre carried it too. She hadn't spoken to him in years, their once close friendship reduced to distant glances at community events. But the letter had brought it all rushing back. What if Andre had also received a message? What if someone else knew what they had hidden for so long? Clara shook her head, trying to silence the questions. But deep down, she knew the truth. The past wasn't done with her, and its shadows were growing darker with every passing moment. The memories lingered like ghosts, refusing to fade as Clara made her way through another restless day. Each step she took seemed to echo with the sounds of her past. Lucas's voice, Andre's sharp laughter, the crunch of leaves under their feet. She found herself drawn to the old photo album hidden in the back of her closet. Sitting cross-legged on the floor, Clara flipped through the pages, her fingers brushing over the faded photographs. There they were, Lucas, Andre, and herself, smiling at the camera, carefree and invincible. The image mocked her, a cruel reminder of everything she had lost. One particular photo caught her attention, the three of them standing on the very bridge that now haunted her dreams. Clara's breath hitched as she traced Lucas's face with her fingertips. His bright, mischievous eyes seemed to stare back at her, full of life and promise. How had everything gone so wrong? She closed the album abruptly, the weight of her guilt pressing harder against her chest. Clara had spent years convincing herself that what happened wasn't her fault, but the letter had shattered that fragile illusion. Someone else believed she was responsible, and their accusations reignited the self-doubt she had buried so deeply. At school, her focus wavered. Her students noticed her distraction, their curious whispers filling the classroom. Julia, ever watchful, confronted Clara again during their lunch break. "You're not yourself," Julia said, her tone soft but firm. "Is this about Lucas?" The question struck Clara like a lightning bolt, her eyes widening in shock. How much did Julia know? Clara stammered, trying to deflect. But the intensity in Julia's gaze didn't falter. "You don't have to carry this alone," Julia added, her voice filled with quiet determination. Clara wanted to believe her friend, but the walls of her carefully constructed world were too thick to let anyone in. By the end of the day, Clara's resolve was breaking. The weight of her secret felt unbearable, each hour stretching into an eternity. As she walked home, the streets of Bella Vista seemed darker, the familiar paths unfamiliar under the shadow of her memories. Her steps led her toward the outskirts of town, where the abandoned bridge still stood, its worn planks creaking under the breeze. She stopped short, staring at it from a distance. The bridge had witnessed everything, holding the answers she feared to confront. Clara's heart raced as she turned away, her retreat another reminder of the power her past still held over her. That evening, Clara sat at her kitchen table, her hands wrapped tightly around a steaming cup of tea. The warmth did little to soothe the cold knot of fear lodged in her chest. Her eyes wandered to the calendar hanging on the wall, its pages filled with dates that seemed insignificant in the shadow of her growing dread. She couldn't help but feel like time was slipping away from her, each passing moment bringing her closer to a reckoning she wasn't prepared for. The letter wasn't just a reminder of her past, it was a warning. Whoever had sent it knew too much, and their silence wouldn't last forever. Her thoughts drifted back to Andre. If anyone understood the weight of what they had endured, it was him. Clara hadn't spoken to him directly in years, but their shared secret had bound them in an unspoken pact. She wondered if he had received a letter too, if the sender was targeting them both. The possibility sent a shiver down her spine. Andre had always been the bold one, the risk-taker, but even his bravado hadn't been enough to erase the guilt they both carried. Clara felt a pang of regret for allowing their friendship to dissolve, knowing that her isolation only made her more vulnerable. As the night deepened, Clara found herself pacing the house, her thoughts restless and chaotic. The shadows in the corners seemed darker, the creaks of the old wooden floor louder. Her mind replayed that fateful night in vivid detail. The argument, the tension, and then the silence that followed. She remembered Lucas's voice calling out, the sound of footsteps retreating into the dark. Clara had been frozen in fear, unable to act, and that hesitation had haunted her ever since. The memory was a relentless storm, tearing through the fragile calm she had built around her life. Suddenly, the shrill ring of her phone shattered the silence. Clara jumped, her heart pounding as she reached for it. The name on the screen made her blood run cold. Andre. Her hand hovered over the phone, hesitation paralyzing her. What would she even say to him after all this time? Finally, she answered, her voice trembling. Clara? Andre's voice was steady but laced with urgency. We need to talk. It's about Lucas. Clara's breath caught, her grip tightening on the phone. The conversation she had avoided for years was now unavoidable, and she felt the weight of her past pressing down on her shoulders once more. The call from Andre lingered in Clara's mind like a faint echo, haunting her as she sat in the quiet of her classroom the next day. The conversation had been brief, but the weight of his words was impossible to ignore. He'd received a letter too. The realization sent a chill through her. Whoever was behind the messages wasn't just targeting her, they wanted to unravel the secret that bound them both. Clara clutched her pen tightly, her knuckles whitening as she stared at the blank page before her. She tried to focus on her lesson plan, but her thoughts were elsewhere, spiraling into darker places. That evening, another letter arrived. Clara's hands trembled as she tore open the envelope, her eyes scanning the lines with growing dread. The writer knew details, intimate pieces of her past that no one else could have known. Panic bubbled within her as she tried to piece together how this could be possible. Her mind raced through the faces of people she had once trusted, searching for a clue. One name surfaced almost immediately. Andre. Could he be behind this? Clara hated herself for even considering the possibility, but the thought refused to leave her mind. Back at home, Daniel noticed Clara's growing unease. He had been patient, offering her space when she needed it, but now his concern was impossible to hide. Clara, are you all right? He asked gently, his eyes searching hers. Clara forced a smile, hoping it would mask the storm raging inside her. Just tired, she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel didn't push further, but the tension between them was palpable. Clara knew she was keeping him at arm's length, but the fear of him discovering the truth kept her silent. She couldn't bear to see the disappointment in his eyes. The letters were beginning to take their toll. Clara's once steady hands now shook with anxiety, her nights restless and filled with nightmares of the past. Julia noticed too, her friend's keen instincts cutting through Clara's carefully crafted facade. You're not okay, Julia said one afternoon, her voice firm but laced with concern. This isn't like you. Clara wanted to confide in her, to release the burden that was slowly consuming her, but every time she opened her mouth, the words refused to come. Instead, she offered another excuse, another lie, knowing it would only deepen Julia's suspicion. Clara couldn't shake the sense of paranoia that now clung to her every step. Each shadow seemed darker, each glance from a passerby felt sharper, as though everyone in Bella Vista knew her secret. The letters were relentless, arriving at odd intervals, each one more invasive than the last. Clara had taken to reading them alone in her car, away from Daniel and anyone else who might stumble upon her torment. Sitting in the driver's seat late one evening, she unfolded the latest note, her heart pounding as her eyes scanned the words. It wasn't just a threat this time, it was a demand. Whoever was behind this wanted her to confront her past or face exposure. Her suspicion of Andre grew with every letter. The timing, The details, everything, pointed to him. Clara recalled the last time she had seen him at a town event. He had been distant, almost evasive, as though he too carried a heavy burden. But what if his guilt had driven him to this? What if he believed exposing their secret was the only way to find peace? The thought gnawed at her, blending anger with fear. She needed to confront him, to look him in the eye and demand answers. But the idea of facing Andre after all these years filled her with dread. Meanwhile, Daniel began noticing the cracks in Clara's demeanor. He tried to hide his worry, but his watchful eyes followed her every move. One evening, as they sat together in silence, he reached for her hand. "Clara," he said softly, "I know something's bothering you. Whatever it is, you don't have to carry it alone." Clara's chest tightened at his words, the sincerity in his voice making her want to collapse into his arms. But the fear of rejection, of losing the man she loved, held her back. "I'm fine," she whispered, pulling her hand away. Daniel's face fell, but he didn't press further, leaving Clara to wrestle with her inner turmoil alone. Julia, however, wasn't as easily deterred. Over lunch the next day, she cornered Clara in the staff room, her voice low but insistent. "If you don't start talking, I'm going to have to start guessing," she said, crossing her arms. "And trust me, you won't like where my mind is going." Clara managed a weak laugh, but it did little to convince her friend. "You're overthinking," she replied, trying to sound nonchalant. But Julia wasn't fooled. Her piercing gaze lingered as though she could see through every layer of Clara's defenses. For a moment, Clara considered telling her everything, but the weight of her secret was too great, and once again, she chose silence. The next day, Clara found herself walking through the quiet streets of Bella Vista, her thoughts a swirling tempest of doubt and fear. The town, once her sanctuary, now felt like a trap. Each familiar corner seemed to mock her, whispering the secrets she tried so hard to conceal. As she approached the park where she and Andre had often spent time with Lucas, memories flooded back uninvited. She remembered their laughter, the way Lucas always seemed to bring life to the dullest of days. But those memories were tainted now, overshadowed by the guilt that had festered for years. Clara decided she couldn't wait any longer. That evening, she called Andre, her voice trembling as she asked him to meet her. "It's important," she said, her words clipped and urgent. They agreed to meet at the edge of the town near the abandoned bridge, a place that held too many memories and too much pain. As Clara waited for Andre under the fading light, her heart pounded in her chest. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth, the quiet hum of cicadas providing an eerie backdrop. When Andre finally arrived, his face was a mix of apprehension and resignation. Their conversation was terse, each word laden with unspoken emotions. "You've been getting them too, haven't you?" Clara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Andre nodded, pulling a crumpled letter from his jacket pocket. "They know everything," he said, his tone heavy with defeat. Clara stared at the paper in his hand, the words blurring together in her mind. She wanted to scream, to demand answers, but she knew Andre was just as lost as she was. For the first time in years, they stood together as equals, bound by a secret that neither could escape. Before they parted ways, Andre looked at Clara with a seriousness that sent chills down her spine. "We need to figure out who's behind this," he said. "If we don't, it's only going to get worse." Clara nodded, the weight of his words sinking deep into her chest. As she walked back home, the darkness seemed to press in closer, suffocating her with its intensity. The letters weren't just threats. They were a countdown to something far more sinister. Clara knew she couldn't hide forever, but the question loomed. Who was pulling the strings? And what would they demand next? Clara could feel the cracks widening. Her once steady relationship with Daniel was now marred by silences that spoke louder than words. He was trying to reach her, but every time he extended his hand, she pulled further away. That morning, as they sat at the breakfast table, the tension was palpable. Daniel's eyes lingered on her longer than usual, his brow furrowed with concern. "Clara, we need to talk," he said gently, his voice breaking the stillness. Clara looked up, forcing a weak smile. "Later," she replied, her tone hollow, but both of them knew later would never come. At work, the weight of the letters pressed heavier on her, making it nearly impossible to maintain the image of the composed and dedicated teacher. Julia watched her friend with growing unease. "You're not just tired, Clara," Julia said during their lunch break, her voice firm. "Something is wrong, and it's time you stop pretending." Clara wanted to tell her everything, to let the words spill out and finally share the burden, but fear held her back. What if Julia couldn't handle the truth? What if her friend looked at her differently after learning about Lucas? Meanwhile, the whispers in town were growing louder. Bella Vista was small, and secrets didn't stay buried for long. Clara could feel the eyes of her neighbors on her, their polite smiles tinged with curiosity and judgment. She overheard snippets of conversations at the grocery store and on the street, her name spoken in hushed tones. "Did you hear about Clara?" one woman murmured to another as Clara passed by. She quickened her pace, her heart pounding in her chest. The isolation was suffocating, and she knew it was only a matter of time before the whispers turned into accusations. At home, Daniel's patience was wearing thin. That evening, as they sat on the couch in tense silence, he finally confronted her. "Clara, this isn't working," he said, his voice tinged with frustration and hurt. "I can't keep pretending everything is fine when it's not." Clara froze, her throat tightening. She wanted to tell him, to explain everything, but the words caught in her throat. "I just need some time," she managed to say, her voice trembling. Daniel sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Time for what, Clara? To push me further away?" His words cut deep, leaving Clara to sit in the heavy silence that followed. The distance between Clara and Daniel grew more pronounced with each passing day. She could see it in the way he hesitated before speaking, the way his once affectionate gestures became cautious and reserved. It wasn't that Daniel had stopped loving her. Clara could feel his concern in every glance, but her secrecy was carving a wall between them. That evening, as they sat down to dinner, the unspoken tension hung heavy in the air. Daniel broke the silence, his voice filled with quiet frustration. "Clara, I'm here for you, but I can't help if you won't let me in." Clara's heart ached at his sincerity, but fear kept her from opening up. Julia, on the other hand, was relentless. She had always been the type to fight for the people she cared about, and Clara's evasiveness only fueled her determination. "Clara, I know you're dealing with something big," Julia said one afternoon, cornering her in the empty classroom after school. "You don't have to carry this alone. Let me help." Clara looked at her friend, her eyes filling with unshed tears. For a moment, she considered telling her, unburdening herself of the secret that had haunted her for years, but then the image of Lucas flashed in her mind and the walls went up again. "I'm fine, Julia," she said softly, forcing a smile. "Really, I am." In the town, the whispers had started to take on a life of their own. Clara couldn't walk into a shop or down the street without feeling the weight of curious stares. The people of Bella Vista were beginning to piece together fragments of the past, weaving their own narratives. At the bakery, Clara overheard a customer mention her name, their tone dripping with speculation. "It's always the quiet ones," they said with a chuckle, unaware that Clara was within earshot. She gripped the edge of the counter, her nails digging into the wood as she fought to keep her composure. The walls of the town felt like they were closing in, leaving Clara with nowhere to hide. One evening, Clara found herself staring at her reflection in the bathroom mirror. The face looking back at her was one she barely recognized, tired, worn, and full of doubt. The letters had become a constant in her life, their presence suffocating. The latest one sat on the counter, its words burning in her mind. "You can't hide forever. Everyone will know soon." Clara clenched her fists, anger mixing with despair. She knew the author of these letters wanted to break her, to force her hand. But the question lingered. How much longer could she keep pretending everything was fine before her world completely fell apart? Clara's nights had become unbearable. The silence of the house, once a comfort, now amplified the storm inside her mind. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her thoughts spinning out of control. The letters felt like they were everywhere, lurking in her purse, in the kitchen drawer, in the shadows of her dreams. Each one was a reminder of the life she had tried to leave behind, and each one pushed her closer to the breaking point. The fear of exposure wasn't just about her reputation. It was about losing everything she held dear. Daniel, her career, and the fragile sense of stability she had built. The tension with Daniel reached a boiling point late one night. He found her sitting in the living room, her face illuminated by the soft glow of the lamp. The crumpled letter in her hand didn't escape his notice. "Clara," he said, his voice firm but laced with worry. "What is that?" Clara froze, her grip tightening on the paper. She felt the walls around her crumble as Daniel took a step closer. "You need to tell me what's going on," he continued, his tone softening. Clara's heart raced. For a moment, she considered coming clean, but fear held her back. "It's nothing," she whispered, her voice shaking. Daniel's frustration was palpable. "I can't keep doing this," he said, walking away and leaving Clara alone with her guilt. Julia's persistence was wearing Clara down as well. During a staff meeting, her friend leaned in and whispered, "We're talking after this. No excuses." Clara nodded weakly, unable to muster the energy to argue. When they finally sat down in the empty cafeteria, Julia's eyes were filled with a mix of frustration and concern. "I know you don't want to talk, but you're not fooling anyone anymore," Julia said, her voice steady. "Whatever this is, it's eating you alive, and you're shutting out the people who care about you." Clara looked down at her hands, her fingers nervously tracing the edge of her coffee cup. "It's not that simple," she replied quietly. Julia leaned closer, her tone softening. "Then make it simple. Let me help." The weight of it all became unbearable as Clara walked home that evening. The streets of Bella Vista were quiet, but the echoes of the past followed her with every step. She paused at the edge of the park, staring at the distant outline of the abandoned bridge. It felt like the bridge was calling her back, daring her to face the truth she had buried for so long. But the fear of what lay on the other side of that truth kept her rooted in place. Clara turned away, her shoulders heavy with the burden she could no longer carry alone. Deep down, she knew the moment of reckoning was fast approaching. Clara stood at the edge of the park, staring down at her phone. Andre's message from earlier replayed in her mind. "We need to meet." It's about the letters. She had tried to ignore him, to pretend she could handle this on her own, but the truth was becoming clearer. She couldn't. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, she made her way to the agreed meeting spot, the old, abandoned bridge. The air was damp, and the wooden planks creaked beneath her feet as she stepped onto the structure that had haunted her memories for years. Andre was already there, his figure silhouetted against the fading light. Their exchange was tense, both of them weighed down by years of guilt and unresolved emotions. "You've been getting them too, haven't you?" Clara asked, her voice trembling. Andre nodded, pulling a handful of letters from his jacket pocket. The sight of them made Clara's stomach churn. "Whoever this is, they know everything," Andre said, his tone bitter. Clara felt a pang of anger rise within her. "How could they? We never told anyone," she snapped. Andre's eyes darkened as he looked away, his silence speaking volumes. The unspoken question hung in the air. Had one of them slipped up? As they talked, the memories of that night came rushing back with painful clarity. The three of them, Clara, Andre, and Lucas, had been inseparable. They had spent that evening at the bridge, laughing and arguing like usual. But things had taken a dark turn. Lucas, always the risk-taker, had climbed the edge of the bridge, daring himself to go further. Clara remembered the fear in her chest, the words she had yelled, and the sudden silence that followed. The image of Lucas slipping, the sound of the fall, and the chaos that ensued were burned into her mind. They had panicked, running away instead of seeking help, and Lucas was never seen again. Andre broke the silence, his voice heavy with regret. "We should have done something back then," he said, his words cutting through the tension. Clara's hands clenched into fists. "We were kids," she replied, her tone defensive. "We didn't know what to do." But even as the words left her mouth, Clara knew they sounded hollow. They had made a choice, and now that choice was catching up with them. The bridge, once their place of joy, had become a symbol of their guilt. Standing there with Andre, Clara felt the weight of the past pressing down on her, suffocating and inescapable. Andre leaned against the rail of the bridge, his hands gripping the rusted metal as though it could ground him. "I've spent years trying to forget," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Clara watched him, her own guilt mirrored in his expression. "I thought if I buried it deep enough, it would disappear," she replied, her voice breaking. The wind rustled through the trees, carrying their words into the void. It was the first time they had spoken openly about that night, the first time they allowed themselves to confront the pain they had both tried so hard to escape. Andre turned to face her, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and sorrow. "But someone knows, Clara. Someone knows everything. They want us to suffer." Clara felt a chill run down her spine as she clutched her arms tightly around herself. "Do you think it's someone from back then? Someone who saw us?" she asked, her mind racing through the possibilities. Andre shook his head, his brow furrowed. "I don't know. But whoever it is, they're enjoying this. Playing with us." His words cut through her, filling her with a sense of dread she couldn't shake. For a moment, the two of them stood in silence, the memories of Lucas heavy in the air between them. Clara's mind wandered back to the days after his disappearance. The town had been in chaos, the search parties combing through the fields and rivers, the whispers of blame spreading like wildfire. She and Andre had made a pact that night, swearing to take their secret to the grave. But now, as the letters unraveled the fragile lives they had built, Clara wondered if they had been foolish to think the truth would stay hidden forever. The past always had a way of finding its way back. Andre broke the silence again, his tone more determined this time. "We can't let them win, Clara. Whoever's doing this, we have to stop them." Clara nodded, though her heart felt heavy with uncertainty. "But how?" she asked, her voice trembling. "We don't even know who they are." Andre's jaw tightened, his frustration evident. "Then we start digging. We figure out who's behind this, no matter what it takes." His words struck a chord in Clara. For the first time, she felt a spark of resolve within herself, a glimmer of hope that they might be able to face this together. But the fear lingered, gnawing at the edges of her newfound determination. The next few days were a blur of suspicion and unease. Clara and Andre decided to meet in secret, carefully avoiding the curious eyes of the townspeople. They combed through old memories, dissecting every detail of that night to uncover any clues they might have missed. The more they talked, the more the weight of their shared guilt became evident. Each conversation peeled back another layer of the walls they had built around themselves. Yet despite their efforts, the identity of the letter writer remained a mystery, their tormentor staying one step ahead, always in the shadows. One afternoon, Clara sat at her dining table, surrounded by the crumpled letters she had hidden from Daniel. Each note was more personal, more cutting than the last, as though the sender was deliberately unraveling her sense of safety. A particular phrase from the latest letter stood out: "You know what happened, but do you know why?" The question gnawed at her. Why would someone resurface now? Was it simply revenge, or was there something deeper at play? Clara's mind raced as she jotted down every possible name, every forgotten detail that might connect to the letters, but the answers eluded her. Meanwhile, her strained relationship with Daniel teetered on the edge. He had noticed her frequent absences and the tension in her voice whenever she spoke. "I feel like I'm losing you, Clara," he confessed one night, his voice breaking. Clara wanted to reassure him, to tell him it would all make sense soon. But how could she? Telling him the truth would mean exposing the darkest parts of herself, the parts she wasn't sure he could forgive. Instead, she stayed silent, letting the distance between them grow. Daniel's patience, once endless, now seemed to be running out. Andre, too, was struggling under the pressure. At their last meeting, he had been unusually quiet, his usual confidence replaced with a growing sense of paranoia. "What if it's someone who knew Lucas?" he asked suddenly, his voice low. "Someone who knows more than we do." Clara's stomach tightened at the thought. The idea that their tormentor might be closer to the truth than they were was terrifying. As they parted ways, Andre placed a hand on her shoulder, his grip firm. "Whatever happens, Clara, we face this together," he said. For the first time in years, Clara felt a flicker of comfort in his words. But deep down, she knew the worst was yet to come. Clara's hands trembled as she held the latest letter, her eyes scanning the harsh, unforgiving words. This one was different. It wasn't just another vague threat or a reminder of her past. It was a direct ultimatum. "Tell them, or I will." The message sent a wave of panic through her. Whoever was behind the letters was no longer content with tormenting her in silence. They wanted her to confess, to expose the truth to everyone she cared about. Clara's breath quickened as the weight of the demand sank in. Her world was on the brink of collapse, and she didn't know how to stop it. The pressure was unbearable. Clara found herself pacing the house, her mind racing with possibilities. She could run, leave Bella Vista and everything behind, but the thought of abandoning Daniel and Julia filled her with despair. She could deny everything, but the letters were proof that someone knew the truth. The third option, the one that terrified her the most, was to tell the truth herself. But how could she admit to something that could destroy her life? Clara sat down at the kitchen table, her head in her hands, as the gravity of the situation threatened to crush her. Daniel's voice startled her from her thoughts. "Clara, what's going on?" he asked, his tone a mixture of concern and frustration. She looked up, her face pale and drawn. Daniel had one of the letters in his hand, the one she had carelessly left on the counter. Clara's heart sank as she realized there was no escaping this moment. "Where did you get that?" she asked, her voice shaking. "It doesn't matter," Daniel replied. "What matters is why you've been hiding this from me." Clara's mind raced, searching for a way to explain, but the words wouldn't come. In a moment of desperation, Clara blurted out a partial truth. "It's about something that happened a long time ago," she began, her voice trembling. "Something I'm not proud of." Daniel's expression softened slightly, but his confusion remained. "Clara, I'm your fiancé. Whatever it is, we can face it together," he said. His words broke something inside her. For years she had carried this burden alone. But now, faced with Daniel's unwavering support, the walls she had built around her secret began to crumble. "It's not that simple," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. The confession she feared the most was now inevitable. Clara could feel her heartbeat thundering in her chest as Daniel sat across from her, his eyes filled with concern. The letter rested on the table between them, its presence as oppressive as the truth it demanded. She took a deep breath, her fingers nervously twisting the edge of her sweater. "It's about Lucas," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel's brow furrowed in confusion. "Lucas?" he asked. Clara nodded, the name hanging in the air like a specter. "He was a friend, someone I cared about, but something happened, and I've been carrying the weight of it ever since." Her words came out haltingly, each sentence feeling like it dragged a piece of her soul into the open. Clara explained the basics: their friendship, their bond, and that fateful night by the bridge. She stopped short of the full truth, carefully avoiding the most damning details. "He disappeared," she said finally, her voice breaking, "and I never told anyone what I saw, what I knew." The room fell silent, Daniel's gaze fixed on her, searching for answers she wasn't ready to give. "Why didn't you say anything?" he asked, his voice a mix of disbelief and sadness. Clara's eyes filled with tears as she shook her head. "I was scared," she admitted. "We were just kids and I didn't know what to do. I thought if I stayed silent, it would all go away." Her words felt hollow, even to her. The guilt she had suppressed for years now lay bare, and she felt exposed in a way she had never imagined. Daniel reached for her hand, his touch grounding her in the moment. "Clara, I'm trying to understand," he said gently, "but you have to tell me everything. What aren't you saying?" The question hung in the air, and Clara hesitated. She wanted to tell him, to unburden herself completely, but fear held her back. What if he couldn't forgive her? What if this was the moment that broke them? "There are things I can't say yet," she admitted, her voice trembling. "But I promise I'll tell you when I'm ready." Daniel's expression was unreadable as he sat back, his hand slipping away from hers. "I hope you do," he said quietly. The distance between them felt insurmountable, and Clara knew she was running out of time to bridge the gap. The tension between Clara and Daniel lingered like a storm cloud, heavy and unyielding. Clara spent the following days walking on eggshells, aware of the growing distance between them. Daniel tried to act normal, but his silence spoke volumes. Clara knew he was waiting, giving her the space to come clean, but the weight of her partial confession gnawed at her. She found herself retreating more into her thoughts, replaying the conversation and questioning if she should have told him everything. But the fear of his reaction, and of losing him, kept her quiet. One evening, as Clara sat alone in the kitchen, another letter arrived. Her heart sank as she unfolded the paper, the words on it sharper and more damning than before. "Your lies won't protect you. Tell the truth before it's too late." Clara's hands shook as she reread the message, her breath catching in her throat. The ultimatum was clearer than ever. Whoever was behind the letters was escalating their game, and time was running out. Clara's mind raced with possibilities. Could it be someone from Lucas's family? A neighbor who had overheard too much? The lack of answers only deepened her panic. The breaking point came the next morning when Daniel confronted her. He had found one of the older letters hidden in her desk, its accusatory tone impossible to ignore. "Clara, what is this?" he demanded, his voice tinged with frustration. She froze, her chest tightening as she realized there was no way to deflect this time. "I'm trying to protect you," she said weakly, her voice trembling. Daniel's expression hardened, his patience clearly wearing thin. "Protect me from what?" "Clara, you need to stop hiding." His words hit her like a blow, and for a moment all she could do was stare at him, guilt and fear warring within her. Finally, Clara broke. She told him more about Lucas, about the bridge, the fight, and the disappearance. Her words came in a rush, disjointed and filled with emotion. But once again, she stopped short of the full truth, unable to bring herself to admit her role in what had happened. Daniel listened, his face unreadable, before quietly standing and leaving the room. Clara watched him go, her heart breaking as she realized her partial confession had only deepened the rift between them. She was losing him, and unless she found the courage to face her past fully, she knew it was only a matter of time before she lost everything. The air in Bella Vista buzzed with anticipation as the town gathered for the annual community festival. The event, usually a time of laughter and celebration, felt different this year, heavier, charged with unspoken tension. Clara moved through the crowd, her stomach churning with unease. She had barely slept the night before, haunted by the ominous tone of the latest letter. "You'll know when the time comes," it had read, a cryptic warning that left her on edge. She felt exposed among the sea of familiar faces, each smile and greeting laced with a suspicion she couldn't ignore. Julia approached her near the food stands, her expression a mixture of concern and frustration. "Clara, you look like you've seen a ghost," she said, pulling her aside. Clara forced a weak smile, but her friend wasn't convinced. "This has gone on long enough," Julia continued. "Whatever is happening, you need to deal with it. Secrets don't stay buried forever." The words struck Clara like a hammer, the truth behind them undeniable. But before she could respond, a hush fell over the crowd. Clara turned toward the stage, her heart sinking as she saw the microphone in the hands of someone she didn't recognize. The man was tall, his face partially obscured by the brim of a wide hat. He cleared his throat, the sound amplified across the square, silencing the hum of chatter. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice steady and commanding, "I have a story to share, one that this town deserves to hear." Clara's breath caught in her throat as she realized what was about to happen. Her legs felt like lead, rooted to the spot as the man's words cut through the silence. "It's a story about betrayal, guilt, and the weight of truth," he continued, his eyes scanning the crowd, "and it involves one of your own." As the man spoke, Clara's worst fears were confirmed. He recounted the events of that fateful night with chilling precision. The argument on the bridge, Lucas's disappearance, and the silence that followed. Gasps rippled through the crowd, whispers growing louder with every detail. Clara felt the walls closing in, her pulse roaring in her ears. She looked to Julia, whose shocked expression mirrored the devastation Clara felt. Somewhere in the crowd, she saw Daniel, his face pale and unreadable. Clara knew there was no escaping this moment. The truth was out, and the life she had fought so hard to protect was unraveling before her eyes. The man's voice grew louder, his words cutting through the stunned silence like a blade. "Clara Martins and Andre Silva," he announced, letting the names hang in the air for what felt like an eternity. Clara's stomach churned, and she instinctively glanced around, searching for Andre in the crowd. He stood near the back, his face ashen and his eyes wide with disbelief. The crowd's whispers turned into murmurs, and Clara could feel their eyes boring into her, piercing through every layer of composure she had left. She wanted to run, to disappear, but her legs refused to move. The accusations were relentless. The man revealed details only someone intimately familiar with the events could know, painting a vivid picture of the night that had haunted Clara and Andre for years. "They knew what happened to Lucas," he said, his voice tinged with anger, "and they chose to stay silent." Clara's hands trembled as she clutched the edge of the nearest table for support. She could see the betrayal etched into the faces of her neighbors, people she had known her entire life. Their trust in her was crumbling, replaced by shock and judgment. Julia was the first to break the silence, stepping forward and grabbing Clara's arm. "Is it true?" she demanded, her voice shaking. Clara opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. Julia's grip tightened. "Clara, answer me," she pleaded, her eyes filling with tears. Clara felt the weight of Julia's desperation, the pain of a friend who had been left in the dark. She swallowed hard, her voice barely audible as she whispered, "It's true." The admission sent a ripple through the crowd, gasps and murmurs growing louder. Clara couldn't meet Julia's gaze, the shame too overwhelming. Daniel moved toward her then, his expression unreadable. Clara braced herself for his anger, his disappointment, but instead he simply looked at her, his voice calm, yet heavy with emotion. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked. Clara's lips quivered as she struggled to find the words. "I was scared," she finally said, her voice breaking. "I didn't know how to face it. How to face you." Daniel's jaw tightened, and he stepped back, his silence more painful than any words he could have spoken. Clara's heart shattered as she realized that her worst fear had come true. She had lost him, and there was no going back. As the crowd erupted in a cacophony of whispers and accusations, Clara felt the world tilt beneath her feet. Someone in the back shouted, "How could you?" while others murmured in disbelief. The weight of their judgment pressed down on her like a suffocating blanket. Andre stepped forward, his face pale but his voice steady. "We didn't mean for it to happen," he said, his words trembling as they left his lips. "Lucas's death was an accident, but we panicked. We were scared, and we made the wrong choice." His voice broke on the last word, but the crowd showed no mercy. A man near the front scoffed, his face twisted with anger. "You left him! You could have saved him!" Clara flinched as though the words were a physical blow. She wanted to scream, to explain, but no explanation seemed enough. Her voice wavered as she finally spoke, addressing the crowd. "We were kids," she said, her eyes brimming with tears. "We didn't know what to do. I've lived with that guilt every day of my life." But her plea for understanding was met with cold, piercing stares. The people of Bella Vista weren't ready to forgive. Not yet. Julia stepped closer, her face a mixture of pain and disbelief. "You should have told me, Clara," she said, her voice cracking. "I could have helped you." Clara shook her head, the tears spilling freely now. "I didn't want you to carry this with me," she said, her voice breaking. "I thought I was protecting you." Julia's expression softened for a moment, but the hurt in her eyes remained. Clara knew she had damaged one of the most important relationships in her life, and the sting of that realization was unbearable. As the man on stage concluded his damning speech, he turned to Clara and Andre, his face impassive. "The truth always comes out," he said, his voice echoing in the stunned silence. "What you do with it now is up to you." With that, he stepped down, leaving Clara and Andre to face the crowd on their own. The townspeople began to disperse, some shaking their heads, others muttering angrily. Clara stood frozen, her heart heavy with the weight of what had just transpired. She glanced at Andre, who met her gaze with weary eyes. "This isn't over," he said quietly. And Clara knew he was right. The hardest part was still to come. The morning after the revelation, the town was eerily quiet, as though Bella Vista itself was holding its breath. Clara avoided leaving the house, knowing that the streets would be filled with whispers and accusing stares. The weight of the previous night's events pressed heavily on her chest, and she could barely muster the strength to get out of bed. Daniel had left early, his absence a sharp reminder of the growing distance between them. Clara sat at the kitchen table, staring at her untouched cup of coffee, wondering if there was any way to rebuild what had been shattered. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. Clara hesitated, her heart racing as she imagined who it might be. Was it Julia? coming to demand more answers, or one of the townspeople ready to confront her with their anger? She opened the door cautiously and was surprised to see Andre standing there, looking just as exhausted as she felt. "We need to talk," he said simply, his voice devoid of its usual bravado. Clara nodded, stepping aside to let him in. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of their shared guilt filling the space between them. "I don't know how to fix this," Andre admitted, running a hand through his hair. "It feels like everything we've tried to build since that night is crumbling." Clara looked at him, her eyes filled with tears. "We've spent so long hiding from the truth," she said softly. "Maybe it's time we stop running." Andre's gaze met hers, and for the first time, there was a flicker of understanding between them. "But how do we do that?" he asked, his voice tinged with despair. Clara took a deep breath, her resolve hardening. "We tell them everything," she said. "No more half-truths. No more hiding. If they're going to judge us, they should at least know the whole story." The idea terrified her, but she knew it was the only way forward. Later that day, Clara reached out to Julia, asking her to meet at the park. When her friend arrived, Clara could see the mix of hurt and determination in her eyes. "I'm here because I want to understand," Julia said, her voice firm. Clara nodded, her hands shaking as she began to recount the events of that night in full detail. She didn't hold anything back this time. Every mistake, every moment of fear, every reason for their silence. By the time she finished, tears were streaming down both their faces. Julia didn't say anything at first, but her presence was a small comfort. For the first time, Clara felt the faintest glimmer of relief. The days that followed were a whirlwind of difficult conversations and reluctant admissions. Clara knew that opening up to Julia had been the first step, but it was far from the last. She and Andre decided to address the town directly, to confront the whispers and accusations with the truth. The thought of standing before the people of Bella Vista made Clara's stomach churn, but she also felt a strange sense of resolve. For years, she had been running from her past, but now she was ready to face it head-on, no matter the cost. The town square was filled when Clara and Andre arrived, the crowd's murmurs swelling as they stepped forward. Clara's hands trembled as she gripped the edge of the microphone stand, her pulse roaring in her ears. Andre stood beside her, his expression somber but steady. Clara cleared her throat, her voice shaking as she began to speak. "I know many of you are angry, hurt, and confused," she said, her eyes scanning the sea of faces. "You have every right to be. What happened to Lucas was a tragedy, and for too long, Andre and I have carried the burden of that night in silence." Her voice cracked as she recounted the events in vivid detail, sparing nothing. She told them about Lucas's dare, the argument, and the moment he slipped. She explained their panic, their fear, and their choice to stay silent. "We were scared," she said, her voice breaking. "We didn't know what to do, and we made the wrong choice. I've lived with that guilt every day since." The crowd was silent, their faces a mix of shock, anger, and, in some cases, understanding. Clara felt the weight of her confession lift slightly, though it didn't erase the pain of the truth. When Andre spoke, his voice was steady but filled with emotion. "I know we can't undo what happened, and I don't expect forgiveness," he said, his gaze sweeping across the crowd. "But I hope that by telling the truth, we can at least honor Lucas's memory in some way." The sincerity in his words resonated with some, but others remained unmoved. Clara could see the division in the crowd. Some whispered to one another, their expressions softening, while others shook their heads, their judgment unwavering. It was clear that the road to redemption would not be easy, but for the first time, Clara felt she was walking in the right direction. As the crowd began to disperse, Julia approached Clara, her face still etched with emotion. "That was brave," she said quietly. Clara looked at her friend, the tension in her chest easing slightly at the words. "It doesn't feel brave," she admitted. "It just feels necessary." Julia nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "Sometimes that's enough." Clara felt a flicker of hope at her friend's support, but she knew this was only the beginning of her journey to rebuild the life she had almost lost. In the days following their confession, Clara found herself navigating a whirlwind of emotions. Some townspeople approached her with quiet words of understanding, their empathy surprising but deeply appreciated. Others, however, avoided her altogether, their disapproval unmistakable in their cold glances and curt exchanges. The division in Bella Vista was palpable, and Clara knew that earning back the trust of the community, if it was even possible, would take time. Yet, despite the lingering judgment, there was a strange sense of freedom in having finally spoken the truth. Daniel returned home late one evening, his footsteps heavy as he entered the kitchen where Clara was preparing tea. She turned to face him, her heart pounding at the sight of him. The silence between them stretched, heavy and charged, until Daniel finally spoke. "I've been thinking about what you said," he began, his voice measured. "About Lucas. About everything." Clara braced herself for the worst, but his next words left her breathless. I'm not saying I understand it all, or that I'm not hurt, but I can see how much you've been carrying this alone, and I don't want you to carry it anymore. His words were a lifeline, and Clara's tears fell freely as she stepped into his arms. Andre, too, found himself at a crossroads. While some in the town continued to ostracize him, others began to see him in a new light. He started volunteering at community events, using the opportunity to show the people of Bella Vista that he was more than his past mistakes. Clara joined him on occasion, their shared efforts helping to rebuild not only their standing in the town, but also their friendship. They both understood that their journey toward redemption was far from over, but they were no longer walking it alone. For the first time in years, Clara felt like she could breathe. Julia remained a steadfast presence in Clara's life, her loyalty unshaken despite the revelations. One afternoon, as they sat together on the porch of Clara's home, Julia reached for her friend's hand. "You've always been the strongest person I know," she said, her voice steady. Clara looked at her, the weight of Julia's words settling over her like a warm blanket. "I don't feel strong," Clara admitted. "I feel broken." Julia squeezed her hand, a small smile playing on her lips. "Sometimes being strong means letting yourself be broken. It's how you rebuild." Clara let the words sink in, her heart lighter than it had been in years. As the sun set over Bella Vista that evening, Clara sat alone, reflecting on the events that had brought her to this moment. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with challenges and lingering pain, but for the first time, she felt a glimmer of hope. By facing the truth, she had begun to reclaim her life, piece by piece. And though the journey was far from over, she knew she wouldn't have to walk it alone. The past no longer held her captive. Instead, it had become the foundation on which she would rebuild, stronger and more whole than ever before. Weeks passed, and the dust began to settle in Bella Vista. While the wounds caused by Clara and Andre's confession were still fresh, the town slowly started to adjust to the new reality. Clara took every opportunity to engage with the community, not to justify her past actions, but to show she was committed to making amends. She volunteered at the local school, organized charity events, and spent time speaking with anyone willing to listen. Each gesture was small but meaningful, a step toward healing the fractures her silence had caused. Daniel, though still reserved, began to show signs of softening. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, he finally broke the silence that had lingered between them. "You've changed, Clara," he said, his tone contemplative. She turned to face him, unsure of where his words were leading. "Not in a bad way," he added quickly. "You're braver now, more honest." Clara felt a lump rise in her throat, his words catching her off guard. "I had to be," she said softly. "I didn't have a choice." Daniel reached for her hand, his touch gentle but firm. "I'm proud of you," he said. For the first time in weeks, Clara felt a flicker of hope for their future. Andre's path to reconciliation was similarly challenging but rewarding. He started mentoring troubled teens at the community center, sharing his story not as an excuse but as a lesson. He spoke about fear, guilt, and the importance of making the right choices, even when it's hard. The teens, many of whom struggled with their own burdens, found solace in Andre's openness. His willingness to be vulnerable turned his once tarnished reputation into a source of inspiration. Clara watched from the sidelines, their bond strengthened by their shared commitment to moving forward. Julia remained a constant source of support, though her relationship with Clara had shifted. There was no denying the cracks left by years of secrecy, but the foundation of their friendship proved strong enough to withstand the strain. Over coffee one morning, Julia finally voiced what had been on her mind. "You know, I used to think you were perfect," she said, her tone light but serious. Clara smiled faintly, stirring her cup absent-mindedly. "I never was," she replied. "I just wanted people to think I was." Julia reached across the table, giving Clara's hand a reassuring squeeze. "Well, I like this version of you better, flaws and all." The process of rebuilding wasn't easy, but Clara found strength in the small victories. Each interaction with the townspeople felt like a step forward, even when their responses were mixed. Some greeted her with cautious smiles, while others avoided her entirely. Clara didn't let the lingering skepticism deter her. She threw herself into acts of service, hoping her actions would speak louder than her past mistakes. Whether it was organizing a fundraiser for the school or helping elderly neighbors with their groceries, Clara embraced the opportunity to reconnect with her community, one gesture at a time. Daniel's presence became a source of quiet reassurance. Though their relationship was far from healed, his efforts to stand by her spoke volumes. One evening, as they prepared dinner together, he surprised her with a question. "What was Lucas like?" he asked, his tone gentle. Clara froze, her hands pausing mid-chop. It was the first time Daniel had mentioned Lucas since the confession. Taking a deep breath, she began to speak, her voice filled with a mixture of sadness and fondness. "He was brave, impulsive, and sometimes infuriating, she said, a faint smile tugging at her lips. But he had this way of making you feel like anything was possible. Daniel nodded, his silence an invitation for her to continue. For the first time, she shared the memories that had haunted her, and in doing so, she felt a small piece of her burden lift. Andre's journey mirrored Clara's in many ways. He often found himself at the center of skeptical glances and whispered judgments, but he chose to face them head-on. His mentoring work brought him unexpected allies in the form of parents who saw the value in his honesty. It's not about erasing the past, he told them during a community meeting. It's about learning from it and making better choices moving forward. Slowly but surely, Andre began to carve out a new place for himself in Bella Vista, one built on accountability and growth. Clara's friendship with Julia deepened as they spent more time together, their conversations shifting from guarded to genuine. One afternoon, as they walked through the park, Julia turned to Clara with a thoughtful expression. "Do you ever think Lucas would forgive us?" she asked, her voice quiet. Clara looked at her friend, the question catching her off guard. After a moment, she nodded. "I like to think he would," she said, her voice steady. "He always believed in second chances." Julia smiled faintly, her gaze softening. "Then maybe it's time we start forgiving ourselves." The words stayed with Clara, offering a new perspective on the path she was navigating. As time passed, Clara began to feel the faint stirrings of peace within herself. The town's whispers grew quieter, replaced by cautious but genuine conversations. At the market, a woman who had once avoided her stopped to chat about the upcoming festival. At the school, a parent thanked Clara for her dedication to the children despite everything. These small moments reminded Clara that while forgiveness was slow, it wasn't impossible. Each interaction brought a sliver of hope, a sign that her efforts to rebuild trust were not in vain. Daniel's steady presence became a cornerstone of her healing. One evening, as they sat on the porch, he reached for her hand. "I'm still here," he said simply, his words filled with quiet determination. Clara felt tears prick her eyes as she looked at him, gratitude and love swelling in her chest. "I don't deserve you," she whispered, her voice trembling. Daniel squeezed her hand gently. "We all make mistakes, Clara. What matters is what we do after." His words echoed in her mind long after the conversation ended, a reminder that redemption was a journey, not a destination. Andre, too, found a sense of purpose in his new role within the community. At a gathering for the youth center, he stood before a group of teenagers, his voice steady as he shared his story. "I thought I could outrun my mistakes," he said, "but the truth is, facing them was the only way I could start to move forward." His vulnerability resonated with the young audience, many of whom were grappling with their own struggles. Clara watched from the back of the room, pride swelling in her chest. Despite everything, Andre had found a way to turn his pain into something meaningful. On a quiet afternoon, Clara found herself standing at the bridge for the first time since her confession. The planks creaked beneath her feet, the memories rushing back in vivid detail. But this time, she didn't feel the same crushing guilt. Instead, she felt a sense of closure. She placed a small bouquet of wildflowers at the edge of the bridge, a silent tribute to Lucas. As she stood there, the wind carrying the scent of fresh blossoms, Clara whispered, "I'm sorry." The words weren't just for Lucas. They were for herself, too. In that moment, she allowed herself the grace of forgiveness. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Clara walked back toward town, her steps lighter than they had been in years. The journey ahead was still uncertain, but she no longer feared it. With the support of those she loved and the lessons she had learned, Clara knew she was capable of facing whatever came next. The past would always be a part of her, but it no longer defined her. She had found strength in vulnerability, redemption in truth, and hope in the possibility of a brighter future. As the video comes to an end, Clara's journey, filled with intense emotional highs and lows, leaves us with a powerful reminder that facing the truth, no matter how painful, can lead to the path of healing and redemption. She may have lost things along the way, but in her honesty, she found something more valuable: the chance to rebuild her life piece by piece. Thank you so much for watching. If this story moved you, please share your thoughts in the comments below. What part of Clara's journey resonated with you the most? And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next emotional twist we'll be exploring. We've got a lot more to come, and trust me, you won't want to miss it. And hey, if you're watching from a different part of the world, we'd love to know where you're tuning in from. Drop your country and city in the comments, and let's connect. See you next time.